So I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about our conceptual approach to trying to understand how capacity and commitment emerge and some of the early findings, but it is very early days. So we're taking off from what we take to be one of the most significant shifts in international development thinking over the last decade or so, which is a bringing in of politics from being a fairly marginal concern to a central concern with international development theory and practice. This quote comes from James Robertson's review of the book on your left there, Douglas North et al.'s Violence and Social Orders. And this marks a shift within new institutional economics, as many of you will be aware, away from thinking that institutions matters is the start and end of development, and a realisation that what underpins the performance and shapes the emergence of institutions are the forms of politics and power relations that underlie them. And this work has become increasingly influential within the World Bank. Think of WDR 2011, which uses the language of political settlements. Our very own Department for International Development now has a high-level policy commitment to promoting inclusive political settlements. So there's some traction of these debates, and what we're trying to do is bring some clarity to how they're thought about. So influenced, perhaps biased by our UK location, by Mushtaq Khan's work in particular on political settlements. And Mushtaq defines political settlements in terms of the balance or distribution of power between contending social groups or social classes on which any state is based. Key to both North and Khan is the importance of elite bargaining. That until elites agree to centralise the use of violence, pool their sovereignty around agreements around property rights, and agree to a set of institutional arrangements which distribute resources and status to powerful groups in society, then institutions simply won't be allowed to function. There's no incentive for them to be allowed to function. And it's this which shapes the capacity of the state to deliver development and institutional strengthening and commitments. And it's this underlying politics which explains the failure of good governance interventions, because there's not enough incentive for those to work. So we get the form of good Western institutions that the good governance agenda had the hubris to try and engineer within developing countries, but not the functioning. And if you can think of an example, then Uganda's quite a good one of what's happened in the last 30 years. Museveni comes to power in the 1980s, having rejected the state's monopoly on violence, kicks out the ruling coalition, puts his own in, purging other elites, co-opting some who he can form a government with in a broad-based coalition, doesn't bring in the North, hence the continuation of conflict in that part of the country. And then his number one concern when he gets up in the morning is how can he organise the distribution of power amongst those powerful actors who can cause him trouble. So how does he share out the rent-seeking opportunities amongst powerful groups through privatisation processes, heads of parastatal, rent-seeking opportunities through ministerial positions, and to circulate that in a way that keeps enough people happy enough of the time. Museveni also needs to worry about capital and worry about the popular vote. So he builds relationships with certain forms of capitalists on a largely collusive basis, which helps to explain some of the failures of industrial policy in Uganda. And under the pressures of democratisation, increasingly, he needs to have a very strong base amongst the rural constituents. So he spends a lot of time building a network of power at the grassroots through populist policies such as universal education and the distribution of cash, very simply, particularly leading up to elections. So this theory begins to help explain the pervasiveness of rent-seeking in developing countries and the reasons why elites act in the way they do. So we think there's some traction to this approach, and we're kind of two cheers for the political settlements approach within ESID, and we're sort of reserving a cheer for something else which we haven't quite identified, but we think there's some problems. We think this approach is yet to be really rigorously tested across different contexts and sectors, and we think there are some biases and blind spots. It's a very rational actor in view of how elites act, very instrumentalist, no room for ideas or ideology. It brings our gaze down within the nation state, ignores the very influential role of global processes on political elites, on the capacities of states. And it's very structuralist. It doesn't allow a lot of room for dynamism or agency. And this is why some development policymakers have found that there's a lack of traction here. It doesn't help them with their everyday grappling with politics and policy. So we're trying to add some value here by bringing in other variables and perspectives, importantly ideas and transnational factors. We want to test it within a range of domains, which I'll talk about, and we're importantly undertaking a comparative approach to both theory building and testing. Now, this isn't going to show up great, so I'm glad that Michael pointed out you can get the paper online. This is our conceptual world. It's not a model or a theory. It's the things that we think matter and the relationships between them. And it does what I've just said in terms of adding in other variables to the political settlements approach. Lance unpacks this in relation to the growth projects a little bit later, hopefully. So that'll be I'll leave that to there. In terms of our comparative research framework, this draws on work by Brian Levy, who divides up the world into two different types of political settlements. And the idea here is that on the vertical axis, we're interested in how political power is arranged within different polities. Towards the top, we have settlements that are characterised by dominant party leaders, dominant parties or dominant leaders, very little chance of them losing power. Towards the bottom, we've got high levels of electoral competition. This doesn't mean democracy. This is often multi-party politics grafted onto informal institutions, and clientelism is what we're terming this competitive clientelism using Brian's terms. And across the horizontal axis, we've got the degree of institutional complexity and capacity. To what extent public institutions are capable of delivering development in more or less impersonal ways. The extent to which, for example, people can be expected to be treated as rights bearers rather than as clients by a range of public organisations. And so we've got countries towards the top left that, for example, dominant parties can expect to be in power for quite a long time and may have longer term time horizons, invest in building institutions, invest in development projects to support their legitimacy. Further down, it's very difficult within the 4-year time horizons with electoral cycles in countries like Ghana, Kenya, Malawi, for political principles to exert control over bureaucrats and to do other than use them as political means of maintaining votes. So there's a tendency further down, quite difficult for high levels of institutional complexity and impersonality to emerge, more likely to see just pockets of efficiency here rather than anything more broad-based. So this is partly how we're dividing the world up, and we're not focusing on the conflict-affected countries towards the left or the countries further along. I just want to talk a bit about what this is getting us, what traction this is getting us, and the idea of dividing up the world in that way is to get towards that middle ground that David highlighted. Not to just say that everywhere is different, but to say there are certain types of incentives, opportunities, risks and constraints in certain regime types that will shape the possibilities of different reforms having different types of traction. And we think that has policy payoffs. Lantern Canals projects, we'll talk about the top row. I'm going to talk a little bit about the next 3 rows in terms of what we're starting to find out about. So in terms of social provisioning, our problem here is not policies or the quantity of service provision, but the quality. Uganda spends 20% of its budget on education. Only 31% of children graduate from primary school, hardly any with the skills required to actually function that they should have gained there. So what we're doing is drawing on some work that Brian Levy and Michael Walton have done with us, and they point out that to attain high levels of performance and accountability in these different types of political settlement is likely to require different types of governance arrangements. So, for example, if you think in top left here, and to take the example of maternal mortality, why has Rwanda been able to accelerate really quite rapid gains in that area, reducing maternal mortality rates from 840 to around 340 between 2000 and 2010? The research that we have on this suggests that it's largely down to top-down incentives and pressures within the political system, very little to do with bottom-up accountability. And in this context, that will only have marginal value and could be disruptive to the dominant forms of politics that seem to be working. Where those more bottom-up forms have worked, say, for example, around participatory expenditure tracking surveys in Uganda around UPE, that was largely also because of the presidential commitment and the political salience of primary education in that country, not just because of bottom-up pressures. So again, in these contexts, the bottom-up is likely to play a limited role. In terms of contexts like Bangladesh and Ghana, where we have fairly poor performance, say, in the education sector that we're looking at, this is partly because the multiple principles in power, high degrees of electoral turnover leading to high degrees of turnover of staff and technocratic cadres, and also partly because of democratisation, high degrees of capture by both workers and managers in those systems, the ways in which unions in some ways drive down teaching standards in these contexts. Now here you could expect to have more traction with bottom-up approaches, but what Levy and Walton's framework tells us and what we're beginning to see is that this is not normally through the bottom-up forms of social accountability that tend to be supported by donors, but more through very politically salient stakeholder mobilisation in conjunction with effective political leadership. And some other sort of good news story here is that it's not just about interest, that ideas can matter. Brian's work on the education system in Western Cape, for example, shows that professional associations of teachers have managed to drive up standards and withstand some of the predatory pressures within the system. So there's no role here for ideas, not just interests. So that's some of what we're getting to. We're just starting some work on women's political empowerment. We're interested in when women are included in the political system and whether that leads to any influence over gender equity policies. And it's interesting that in 3 of our 4 cases, excluding Ghana, they all have political quotas. And we think this is traceable to the nature of the political settlement and key moments at which power relations were formed within those entities. Often in the post-conflict phase where women came to form a politically salient constituency, whether through the atrocities visited on them in the Bangladeshi case or by their active role in armed struggles and recovery in the other 2 countries. That moment seems to have created the possibility of political entitlement. And then moving forward, the specific ways in which the political settlement is unfolding in these 2 different types of contexts seems to be shaping whether or not women's inclusion is enabling to exert influence. And we're looking at laws around domestic violence, for example. And it's striking that the ways in which power is arranged in Rwanda and Uganda means that women's empowerment is closely constrained by the functioning of the dominant party system, very much beholden to what the president wants to do in those particular contexts. And we're seeing the gains increasingly being lost in Uganda, where women are being treated effectively as a vote bank for the ruling party, whereas the ideological stance of the leader in Rwanda seems to be withstanding that and maintaining a programmatic focus on women's rights, with some gains in terms of policy implementation, not just having policies on the books. Now, despite greater political space within the other countries we're looking at, which we're terming competitive clientelistic settings, that greater space hasn't resulted in greater traction for women's movements. They're finding it very difficult to navigate a very partisan political space, and they're finding it difficult to generate the social and financial capital required to play patron-client forms of politics and get into those informal spaces where real decision-making happens, and as a result forming different alliances with femocrats, for example. So we think this approach can have traction on strategies as well. And the last one, this is my favourite. If you want to know about politics and how it's changing in developing countries, then where better to look than oil? And this is the case of offshore and onshore oil in Ghana and Uganda. Now, if you take a standard institutional analysis here, you'd expect Ghana to be doing a lot better. It's got multi-party democracy, its CPI ratings are in excess of Uganda's. Now, we're not really finding that. We're finding that if you take a political settlements approach, it's giving us more traction on what's happening. Let's give 3 examples of this. If you think about the way in which oil is being governed, it's clearly being shaped by the nature of the ruling coalitions in each country. The presidential control in Uganda, very tightly managing it with close involvement of military and family allies in terms of operations with oil companies. In Ghana, you have a race, a world-breaking race from discovery of oil in 2006 to production in 2008, right in line with the electoral timetable. And this means that Ghana starts producing without new legislative arrangements in place. Not exactly best practice. Parliament in Ghana has been very acquiescent, hasn't really made any changes to the legislation that has come through. The stakes are very high in Ghana around electoral turnover. People toe the party line. Whereas within the dominant party in Uganda, they've been managed to exact more changes, particularly in the upstream bill that was passed recently. And finally, where things are working, it's not really according to best practice institutions. In Ghana, we get a sense that some of the best deals that were made for the national interest around production sharing agreements were made when the GNPC, the Ghana National Production Company, held regulatory and commercial functions, not good practice, and is strongly embedded within the ruling party, the NDC. And this level of collusion was actually very effective in terms of relations between politicians and bureaucrats being on the same page and securing quite good deals. In Uganda, we're finding that ideas do matter in terms of allowing islands of efficiency to function. The petroleum exploration unit is one example of that. So I'll skip this slide because I've sort of made it to the point already. We think the approach has got traction. We think our added value to it is also coming through, but we've got a long way to go before we can be sure about this. So the last thing to say is to what does this all mean for policy and practice? Again, this is far too premature to give you precise findings, but the direction of travel is broadly that aid is often part of the problem, that it can prop up forms of patronage and rent-seeking by the nature of its resource, and the ways in which aid undermines accountability relationship between states and citizens. And to the extent to which politics is the real problem, aid has limited levers on changing that and big sovereignty problems in trying to grapple with it. To the extent that aid has a future in such context, then it needs to be much more closely attuned to the different types of political settlement that exist and fit their interventions in relation to the prevailing incentives and ideas within them. This requires political analysis, which Pablo will talk to us about shortly. And interestingly, it may require working not directly on governance institutions, but in a more sort of parametric way. There's some evidence that structural transformation is one of the best drivers of good governance and democracy, and creating the conditions for that by changing class configurations and enabling more autonomous forms of socio-economic power to emerge that don't rely on rent-seeking. So this is some of the directions we're starting to move in, but I think I'm overstepping, so let me drop off the stage. Thanks.